Consider supporting Archaeo-Soup on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Link available in the video description. Good morning, Mike Heyworth.
Morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here today in these strange times. And of course, good morning to Andy Brockman. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Hello. And today we've invited Mike for an interview to mark the coming of a new chapter in the Council for British Archaeology. Mike is the outgoing director of the Council for British Archaeology, having served in that role for 15 years, and as he just informed me, otherwise being involved with the CBA for 30 years. So this is an experienced fellow we have before us today, and we felt it was worthwhile exploring. And reflecting a little bit back on Mike's tenure, obviously as director, but also actually this is a very prescient moment to have a bit of an interview about this organisation, because we are in the 75th year of this venerable council as well. So the CBA, big numbers all over the place at the moment. At the risk of sounding a bit Trumpian there, big numbers, fantastic numbers. You won't believe the numbers. Now, it's worthwhile beginning our questions today with an immediate issue, and that is to say that at the moment you are stepping down in the context of the pandemic, a global pandemic, COVID-19, and I suppose a question would be, how do you feel, Mike, the sector is responding to this challenge? Of course, this is a developing response, but do you think that there are particular issues that archaeologists face as a result of this pandemic?
Well, obviously, these are unprecedented times for all of us, and we're all having to think very hard and very quickly about how we respond. Obviously, the big concern in the last few days has been around fieldwork and whether it's appropriate with social distancing for archaeological fieldwork to continue. It seems to me almost impossible for archaeological fieldwork to continue in these circumstances. And so I'm really pleased to see that the vast majority of archaeological contractors have decided that this is not a moment to be doing archaeology, and that they shouldn't be imposing on their staff and expecting them to go out in often quite difficult circumstances. They should be following the Prime Minister's instructions. They should be staying at home. Now, of course, that has major potential consequences for archaeology. And CBA has been working with some of our key national partners to think a little bit about some of those scenarios. What will happen, for example, if a development is going ahead and the archaeological work in advance of that development is halted? Is there a scenario where the developers may want to try and press ahead and say we're not going to have the archaeology? But obviously, in most cases, that's done through a planning condition. So we hope that planning authorities will make sure that they adhere to those planning conditions. But that's an area we'll be watching very closely. But obviously, the key concern at this time is for the people, is for archaeologists, and we need to make sure that they have every opportunity to be safe and stay healthy.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I know, so I'll hand over to you in a second, Andy. But it's interesting that there has been a slightly divergent response in the archaeological community, similarly to the building sector as well. Many workaday archaeologists are a little bit angry that this is even being suggested. I've seen some fairly harsh responses actually along those lines. But as you say, it's worthwhile noting that, for example, I've never been on a dig site that didn't have a relatively small, if we're lucky, maybe indoor room for lunch, or if you're all packed in the back of a van or something for coffee breaks. It is very difficult in those circumstances to have adequate distancing. What's the latest from the Historic England, Andy, that you were touching on yesterday?
Well, it's a developing situation. Historic England yesterday came out with a statement, which we published a story on last night, which effectively said that until the government clarifies the situation, and there have been mixed messages from government, I think Mike would agree. As Mike was suggesting, archaeological field work probably isn't sustainable At the moment, we're all doing our level best, I think, to try and cope with, as we said, unprecedented times. I'd like to sort of move the conversation on a little bit, though. In terms of the CBA itself and its response to COVID-19, now, obviously, I would imagine your office is closed. People are working remotely where they can.
Yeah.
The big event and what was meant to be the flagship celebration really is the Festival of Archaeology, which was due to take place in July. At the moment, and I realise we can only speak in the moment, is the festival still going ahead, and have you got contingency plans if public gatherings and public events are still forbidden by the government when we get to July?
It's very difficult to talk about those sort of things, isn't it, at the moment, because we just don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. I mean, some people may suggest that a lot of the current restrictions will be reduced or relaxed by then. Some people suggest that we'll be in this situation for several months. So obviously we're looking at all those options and various contingencies. Luckily for me, it'll be a decision for my successor as to what happens with the festival this year. But yeah, whatever happens, I'm sure there'll be an opportunity online to celebrate some of the fantastic things that go on in archaeology. And even if that means we can't hold a physical event this year, it'll come back bigger and stronger next year.
Yeah.
And in terms of that celebration, really, and celebrating your 15 years as director, what are you most proud of achieving in that time? Obviously, a lot's happened. A lot of water has passed under the archaeological bridge in those 15 years.
It certainly has. We're in a very different place now from when I started with CBA, which was nearly 30 years ago. Looking back, that was a period when literally just PPG 16 was coming in England and the equivalents in other parts of the UK. And some of those changes that have happened over that period are quite profound. But I think we still have some way to go. CBA is one of our big issues and big areas of advocacy has always been around encouraging more public participation, more public engagement. One of our concerns still about development-led archaeology is that there are not enough opportunities for public engagement through that process. I was involved with the Southport report. I was involved in the putting together the heritage section for the NPPF. There are lots of opportunities to do that, but again, a lot of it comes down to appropriate planning conditions being put when it goes through. I still think we've got a little way to go there to make sure we derive maximum public value from all of this work. But obviously, the CBA, over the period I've been director, has been involved in a huge number of activities and some amazing projects, all of which I'm incredibly proud of. The thing that really always stands out for me is our Young Archaeologists Club, which I think is absolutely fundamental to our sector. And the fact that when CBA took that over in 1993, I drove down to Kate Pretty's house in Cambridge, picked up all the material from her garage, brought it back to CBA headquarters in York, and we then took it on. At that point, it had 6 branches. It now has nearly 80 branches all around the UK. And if you think about the fact that each of those branches puts on something like 10 events a year, the incredible opportunity that's given to young people, a sustained opportunity over years of their formative life, is really quite fundamental. And I don't think you see many other disciplines and professions doing that sort of thing. So I think that's a really important thing for me.
That actually leads on to another question which we had, which is your tenure as director really coincided with a period when you could argue the public was better educated about the archaeological process through programs like Time Team and Meet the Ancestors than really it had ever been before. Do you think those shows did give the heritage sector an audience of receptive members of the public to build on? And how do you think the sector has actually picked up that baton and carried it effectively?
I think those programs were only good for archaeology. It introduced people to a subject that perhaps they hadn't come across in any detail before. One of the challenges for us now, particularly, is that people don't study archaeology at school. There's no GCSE, there's no A-level, there's no opportunity for people to really understand what archaeology is all about. And so television is a fantastic medium for doing that. And I think it's been great to see the flourishing community archaeology sector over the last 15, 20 years, particularly with support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund as it is now. But I think there's more we can do to reach out to broader audiences, to more diverse audiences. And yeah, YAC's a fantastic medium for that, but we need to think a little bit beyond that. YAC is for 8 to 16-year-olds. What about 16 to 25-year-olds? And that's an area that CBA is going to be giving more attention to over the next few years in working with a number of partners to try and make sure that people have a real opportunity to sustain that level of interest. And if they want to get involved in the profession, in become part of the workforce, but also equally, if they don't want to, have a flourishing opportunity to have an interesting time with archaeology projects.
Yeah. Well, do you see then, therefore, we've got this sort of, I guess, a slight dichotomy there between increased engagement in the Young Archaeologists Club, 80 venues across the country, and also people seemingly turning their backs on exam boards, in particular, turning their backs on GCSE and A-level archaeology. Is this sort of crucial next step, this sort of early 20s bracket, a place where we can, as you hinted at, maybe get people more involved in, say, the development process and understanding that, and maybe demystify perhaps these processes in a way that's also meeting the I suppose the platform objectives of organisations like Young Archaeologists Club. Is that a natural extension, meeting, I suppose, killing a couple of birds with one stone, maybe?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that young people through YAC have a fantastic opportunity to learn about what archaeology is, get involved in some of the processes, take part in excavations and other fieldwork projects. But there's nothing really like that beyond. And if you go to a lot of local societies, some of our traditional county societies, the membership of those societies is predominantly older, 55 plus, and they're all interested in finding ways to get more young people involved. And I think the challenge for us as a sector is how do we make that transition from people who are active YAC members into active society members. And so we make sure that those societies are flourishing, are using modern technology, modern techniques, which appeal to young people, so that they get more involved. And I think we'll all benefit from that.
Yeah,
I think one at the root of all those issues, I think, of delivery is obviously money and resources. And you weren't long into your tenure at CBA when we had the financial crash in 2008, and then the Cameron coalition in 2010, which set out to effectively shrink the state, which included shrinking the CBA's budget substantially very early on in the period of that government, and at the same time radically reforming planning with the National Planning Policy Framework, which cut down on the number of volumes you had to read, certainly, to create the National Planning Policy Framework. But how do you feel the sector has weathered those challenges of reform planning and reduced resources?
I think the NPPF in England, and obviously there are equivalent documents in other parts of the UK, was a step in the right direction. I mean, the fact that it had a chapter on the historic environment alongside the natural environment and similar areas of activity was clearly really important. But of course, what was always more important was the bits at the start that talked about what you give weight to. And that's where we were always nervous that the historic environment chapter would always be trumped by economic development factors or job issues, etc. But actually, the way it's played out, I think archaeology's done extremely well out of the NPPF. And I think there's still more opportunities for us to explore in that area. And if you look at the amount of money that's spent on archaeology across the UK and compare that to what was the situation 30 years ago, it's absolutely colossal. We need to make more opportunities to demonstrate the public value of that research, which is what it is really fundamentally. And how we bring it all together. But of course, the one of the challenges for our sector, and as you allude to, Andy, is the fact that we don't have a kind of a flourishing base for our sector. We're a very small sector. If you look at the key national organisations, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists or Council for British Archaeology, we're very small organisations. So we don't really have the capacity to develop the discipline in the way that perhaps we'd like to do. And when you look to the national agencies, they've all taken very significant cuts to their funding over the last few years as well. One of the things I'd really like to see develop along the lines of what the Arts Council do, through national portfolio organisations and the way that they support the core costs of key organisations in the sector. I'd like to see a little bit more of a move for that in the heritage sector, that we have a stronger core to what we do. Because so often you have to rely on project funding, and that's not ideal for these situations for all sorts of obvious reasons.
Well, obviously we have a case in point at the moment with the Thames Discovery Programme being under threat again. It's been well supported by the Museum of London Archaeology, but they're having to make their own decisions at the moment, and the Thames Discovery Programme may be one of the casualties of that. Moving on to sorry, Mark, go on.
Well, I was going to say, I suppose we can come back to this notion of the future of the identity of archaeology, especially from a public perception, in just a moment. But I suppose a related question would be, a certainly prescient question, would be that obviously the NPPF and PPG 16 itself also came out of more or less the context of being involved in a broader international community, namely the European Union, and principles such as the polluter pays principle, etc., that guided these guidelines, and sort of made sure that some of the principles that you suggested might take precedent. For example, development or the economy, they were kept in check because of things like polluter pays. If you want to build something, you also have to be aware of the impact you're having on the environment and also the historic landscape. Now, I know we touched on this in a previous interview, but where do you think we're at now in a sort of post-Brexit, transition period world, in terms of the outlook for that legislation, in terms of the protection of the environment and also the historic environment as well? Are some of these principles actually under serious review to the point of being at threat, or do you actually think do you still think this is an opportunity as you did a couple of years ago?
I still think it's all to play for. And clearly, the CBA and other heritage organisations are working very closely with a whole range of other organisations, those in the natural sector, for example, through groupings like Wildlife and Countryside Link, to try and make sure that the legislation that's now going through the UK Parliament, the Environment Bill, the Agriculture Bill, other relevant legislation, contain the right hooks to make sure that the key principles that we've really based our endeavour on over the last 20, 30 years will be sustained in the future. At the moment, as far as we can tell from what government are saying, there is no immediate threat to some of those things, but we want to try and make sure that there are firm bases in legislation, not necessarily left to secondary legislation or policy, which can be changed much more easily. So we're pressing very hard. We're working with parliamentarians through the All-Party Parliamentary Archaeology Group to try and make sure those things happen. But of course, we're also nervous because we're increasingly seeing, particularly in England, planning reforms coming forwards, which are kind of nibbling away at that. And particularly in terms of the character of some of our industrial and urban areas. The thing that more things are now being kind of taken into permitted development, which means they don't need planning development. And yet they'll have a very significant impact on the character of some of our landscapes. And it might mean that archaeological work is not needed or not required in advance of some of those developments, which means we'll lose knowledge, lose potential for understanding. So, we have to watch very, very carefully. We have to make sure that the public are behind us, and that members of county archaeological societies and other groups are pressing hard, so that elected officials know that they care for their historic environment. They're interested in their local archaeology. They're passionate advocates for us, but we need to be giving them the ammunition. And the CBA ran the Local Heritage Engagement Network project, funded by Esme Fairbairn Foundation, which was putting in place a lot of the material, a lot of the toolkit that's needed to get that advocacy going. And we're going to need that more than ever, I think, over the next few years. We need to watch very, very closely what's going on.
Okay. On that, though, Mike, and getting back to the issue of resources, given those challenges that you've just been discussing. You mentioned also other national organisations. How does the CBA survive when similar environmental groups, interest groups, educational charities, the National Trust, Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Friends of the Earth, Council to Promote Rural England, and so on, have mass memberships and therefore greater financial resources? They can perhaps mobilise larger elements of public opinion, potential voters, and also they can, as well as the impact that has on lobbying, it enables them to commission original research, to question government decisions, and also in extremis to seek judicial reviews where it appears that local or national government has got it wrong. Obviously, at the moment, CBA hasn't been able to engage on that playing field, has it?
I'm not sure that's true. Obviously, I'd love to have the memberships and the resources of some of these larger organisations. That'd be great, and that's something that the CBA needs to keep in mind and keep pushing towards, I think. But actually, we often work very closely with these organisations, and we have very similar interests. It's a false dichotomy between to draw between the historic and the natural environment sector. Often, many of the sites that are of particular interest to the natural environment sector are suitably historic too. And actually, we have very similar interests when it comes to environmental protection. So often we can work very closely together, and that's why CBA has been an active member of groups like Wildlife and Countryside Link, because often it means we can actually draw on the resources and the power of some of those bodies to make the points that we make. And often when I go to meetings with the planning minister, for example, I often go with a group of colleagues from the natural environment sector just as often as I go with colleagues from the historic environment sector. Do you sometimes we're working together?
Yeah.
Do you sometimes wish there wasn't this split between the natural and historic environment, and we just talked about the environment in general?
I think that would be a strength. I mean, I do have to keep reminding some of my colleagues in the natural environment sector that it's not really natural. It's the product of human interaction with the landscape over millennia.
Yeah, of a Neolithic natural disaster, arguably, but
so they understand that. But in a lot of it's about language and just making sure that we're talking about language in an inclusive way, and actually just talking about it in terms of the environment is really helpful, I think, like that.
Okay. Do you feel, therefore, that working in partnership, then, as opposed to against more publicly recognised environmental and grand house maintaining organisations, for example, is effective as positioning the CBA as a foot in the door kind of organisation in Parliament, for example, with the cross-party commission, in terms of lobbying in other ways? How have you found the ability of the CBA to sort of, as it were, manoeuvre between the different interests in terms of economy, environment, and also the historic agenda? Have you found these interactions and conversations with politicians and also obviously senior civil servants, etc., in Whitehall? Are people actually receptive to the nuances of the need for these conversations, or actually do you find that decision makers would much rather that there was a simpler approach to legislation, much in the vein of maybe just talking about environment as opposed to particular key concerns from individual smaller lobby groups?
I think what politicians want is clarity. And I think that's what we want too, as citizens in many cases. And so often the clarity can come from having things where you do talk about things in a more holistic way, the environment. But you're always going to need that level of detail as well. And that's kind of where the split between primary and secondary legislation comes in. Certainly all the conversations I've had with politicians and civil servants, both at a national level in the four home nations and at local level, through county councils, district councils, etc. I've never heard anybody say, well, perhaps with one exception, say that they don't think archaeology is important. And
can you name that exception?
Well, you'll remember a certain Councillor Melton from
of course, yes,
the Fens a few years ago.
Yeah, can't we all be volunteers? Yeah.
came into my mind.
Bunny hugging volunteers.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I had an interesting debate with him on the PM program a few years ago,
I can imagine.
which I think in the end he too acknowledged that actually this wasn't about trying to put in place systems that destroyed archaeology, and when we talk to developers, developers understand that it's really the process that we have at the moment works well for them, means that they can reduce the risk at later stage of the expensive stage of their development, and they can still extract good value from the work, which often the local people appreciate and make them value their development more. So I think we're pushing at an open door in these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, fundamentally, the question still is, when it comes down to it, is about resources, and that's where the haggling goes on, and that's where we have to press the case and make the case that the archaeological work needs the appropriate time, it needs the appropriate resources put into it, and of course, the sadness for us when you start to think about resources is still the really appalling paying conditions that the majority of archaeologists work under. And for me, that has got to be one of the issues that we address fundamentally over the next 10 years, as a real matter of urgency. It isn't difficult. It isn't easy. It isn't going to be straightforward. You can't. There's no magic wand to suddenly make it change overnight. But we can do it ourselves. We have the power to make those changes ourselves. And I think we need to be working much more collectively to make sure that archaeologists in the future are rewarded much more appropriately for the level of skill and experience that they have.
Okay.
That's a really interesting point. One of the things we wanted to explore with you was whether you had any sympathy for the argument or come across the argument that developer-funded archaeology, which is where we're talking about primarily about paying conditions, where the developer-funded archaeology had too much of an influence over policy in the heritage sector, over and above particularly grassroots and what we might call pure research of an academic kind that was done by universities and is still done by universities nationally and internationally. If paying conditions are going to improve, hang on. Can I just make one quick point here? If paying conditions are going to improve, that's going to have to be done by the contracting units. When they're in a marketplace where they have to get work, they have to provide a competitive bid. Is that going to happen?
Well, and also with the caveat, that we've also just discussed this notion that decision makers are looking for clarity as well. So that I guess there's an element there in terms of people are bidding against each other within a sector. A clear voice in terms of raising everyone's standards can't be straightforward. But anyway, so Mike, go ahead.
Well, I think the fundamental answer is we have to move away from a system where the awarding of contracts is based on price. It should be based on quality. And skills and experience are an important part of providing that quality and ensuring that quality. It shouldn't be beyond our capability to come up with a better approach that makes sure that we can suitably reward archaeologists who are working in the field. That has to be done on a collaborative basis. It's very difficult for one organisation to say they're going to do it because they feel they'll be undercut by other organisations who are not going to do it. But then, that's where we have to be working and thinking together. I don't have a simple answer to it. I don't think it's clearly not a simple question.
No.
But it's an area where we should be devoting more effort on behalf of the archaeologists of now and in the future.
It's interesting because you appear to be there quite justifiably stepping onto an area that has been largely occupied by organisations, for instance, like CIFA, Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. It's something of a departure for CBA to start to venture into that territory?
Yeah, we've always worked very closely with our colleagues in other organisations. We've recently signed a memorandum of agreement with CIFA about how we collaborate, particularly as joint advocates. And CBA has long pressed the case for appropriate rewarding for archaeological work. I don't think that's something that's a particularly new departure for us at all.
And talking of the CBA as a mediator and as an advocate, and actually, again, this also touches on developer-funded archaeology. Taking one particularly current example, the A303 tunnel project in the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site has split the archaeological world right down the middle, with a number of larger bodies perhaps sitting on the fence. There are strong lobbies on all sides of the argument. Where do you feel the CBA sits in that argument? Obviously it's a complicated one, but how do you see arguments like that developing when there's a pressure for economically for the road, and on some people for the research that could bring, and others say actually this is a step too far and a World Heritage Site shouldn't be damaged in that way?
Well, as you know, Andy, the CBA has taken a long-standing interest in Stonehenge. There's rarely been a trustee meeting over my 15 years as director where it didn't come up in one shape or form. And we've been very active in the public inquiries and the public examinations that have taken place, including the most recent one. We are not persuaded that the current proposal is the right one for that World Heritage Site. We spoke against the plans at the public examination. And if you go and look at the documents that were provided for that, you can see the detailed arguments behind that. It is a complicated argument, not a straightforward thing. We're certainly not an organisation that thinks you could never have any development in a World Heritage Site. I think there is room for discussion, and certainly the most recent proposal is a significant improvement on previous proposals, but it's just not quite there yet in our view. Particularly at the western end. Now, of course, we're waiting to see what the detail is of the government's decision. We still haven't seen the report of the inspectors from the public examination. We don't know what their recommendations were. We don't know whether the government overturned their recommendations. We haven't yet heard from the Secretary of State for Transport, who makes the official decision, which is due within the next week. So I think we need to see the detail. I suspect it will go to judicial review. I think there are a whole range of issues that need to be thought about a little bit more, not just archaeological issues, but issues to do with transport linked to climate change. And obviously the recent decision linked to the Heathrow runway is going to be pertinent here too. So I think it's got a long way to go. And the CBA will continue to maintain an active interest. But at the moment, it isn't a proposal that we would support.
No. Do you think then that this is actually part of a healthy relationship between these different interest groups? It is, in so much as we live in a country that has an adversarial legal system, and in that sense, the conversations between, for example, Historic England, who increasingly have been acting as a facilitator for government policy, shall we say. A more cynical person might even say an enabler for some elements of more aggressive development on the border of battlefields, for example. That in that sort of situation, that actually having a voice, or having voices which are pushing for a more sceptical analysis of plans, is healthy and necessary and should continue. In so much as you say, it's not as though you have even dived in and said no. You're just saying, well, actually, that's not necessarily the best idea. Judicial review. Let's see what happens, and you're trying to trim the fat off this as potentially or such things as potentially bad ideas. Is that going to have to be a key role continuing into the future for the CBA if we're going to have a healthy balance between planning policy and our ability to engage with the historic environment?
Absolutely, and fundamentally, that's democracy, which I hope will continue.
Yes, fingers crossed. Yes.
The CBA obviously is one of the national amenity societies, so we have a particular role in the planning system in England and Wales, looking particularly at listed building casework where there's a proposal to demolish or partially demolish a listed building. But we see that role as a broader role. We're waiting with interest to see the DCMS consultation coming out soon on scheduling. Our view is that scheduling should be a more open and transparent process, and we'd like to be involved in some of the key issues and principles that underpin some of the decisions that are taken in relation to scheduled monument consent. We're actively making representations to local planning authorities on a wide range of casework, not just listed buildings, but also archaeological sites too. And fundamentally, obviously, those arguments have to be made in the context of government policy. And that's why we invest so much effort in trying to influence government policy and in legislation. But if the policies aren't right, then it removes our opportunity to make those arguments further down the line when it comes to specific cases. And I think you can argue over the years we've been quite successful in influence government policy in relation to the historic environment sector very, very broadly. And clearly in England, we work very closely with Historic England. And Historic England have a particular place in the system. They are the government's advisor. Their advice is confidential to government, so we don't know what they're saying to government often. But actually, a lot of their public pronouncements and in a lot of the meetings that we go to, we're working absolutely shoulder to shoulder with them in terms of trying to maintain and enhance the heritage protection systems in England. And I know that the same, although with slightly different jurisdictions, etc., works in other parts of the UK too. Fundamentally, we're all historic environment professionals, and we're all speaking up for the historic environment.
Okay.
What may that continue?
And starting to, I guess, draw this to an end. We have just got a couple more areas we wanted to cover, but something that's just from what you've just been saying, another one of the consultations which we're waiting on publication of is the DCMS's publication consultation on the Treasures Act, which impacts on the future of metal detecting as a hobby. And obviously we've just had the launch of this year's report from the Portable Antiquities Scheme, but at the same time, we've had controversial issues such as proposed rallies on sensitive archaeological sites that have gone ahead or have been proposed without consultation, for example, with county archaeologists, as per the voluntary code of practice. Do you think metal detecting, the status quo can be maintained, or do you think it likely that we'll see changes in the future?
It's an interesting area, one that I've been heavily involved in over the years. And as you say, we're awaiting the outcome of the government's consultation on the Treasure Act and the Code of Practice. And it was interesting that they included in that consultation some specific questions about the future regulation of metal detecting. Rallies clearly are one of the most problematic areas, and I would love to see rallies banned. I think we need to work harder with groups like Natural England to make sure that rallies are not taking place on land that's under environmental stewardship, or if they are, then the appropriate regulations are being followed, which would ensure that the authorities did know about them in sufficient time. I'm sceptical as to whether that's happening all the time at the moment. One of the few advantages of the current pandemic is that rallies can't happen, and that's a blessing for all of us, I think.
Well, not unless they have a 2-meter grid system. I mean,
I can't see them going with that somehow. But I think the other interesting area then is about individual detectorists. And obviously, when I brought various organisations together to eventually negotiate and produce the Code for Responsible Metal Detecting in England and Wales, that was to me quite a milestone moment, because it meant now that we have clear, detailed criteria against which you can demonstrate whether a detectorist is acting responsibly and appropriately or not. And as long as the PAS continues with the resources it needs to do its work, then we have the mechanisms in place to do that. There are circumstances in which metal detecting can be a good thing and can add to our knowledge and understanding of the past. It's a tool. It's not the tool, it's what goes on in the mind of the person that's using it. But far too many people are not using it for that purpose. They are using it for personal gain, and that isn't responsible. And I think, if metal detectorists continue in that vein, it won't surprise me if government will continue to look at ways in which they may need to bring in more regulation.
Yeah. Well, actually, a related question that also actually leads quite neatly into one of the questions sent in on Twitter by a chap called Tristan. Actually, you probably know him, Tristan Boyle, archaeology podcast. I think you've met him. And that is, it sort of merges together with the thought that's just occurred to me, in so much as, how do we get people who either are decision makers or who are respected in other realms, other professional and also hobbyist realms, to understand the priorities of archaeology and why they exist in the way that they do? And the reason the thought has occurred to me is that the hobby of metal detecting is entirely legitimate. I wouldn't want to ban it personally, but at the same time, I've had for example, recently I was sat down at a dinner with a departmental meeting of various historians and archaeologists, and there was an art historian sat next to me who you would think would be sympathetic to how archaeologists want to tell stories and understand the past through the artifacts that we recover. But he proceeded to show me a series of photographs of finds that he had made over the weekend at a nondescript location. He said, I don't want people to know where I found this. He said to me, knowing I was an archaeologist, and expected me to be simply and only excited for him for having found things, as opposed to understanding the value of those things. And it wasn't the venue for me to start an argument or to start a serious debate. So I just sort of nodded politely and went, "Oh yeah, well, that's very interesting. That looks like a Saxon brooch or whatever, Oh yes, very, And he was on the verge, more or less, of asking, "What do you think these are worth?" And this is a professor of art history. This is someone who we shouldn't have to work too hard to win that argument with. Um, and specifically in case of Tristan's text, he was saying essentially, how do we build consensus on these priorities with decision makers, organisations, and bodies to bring them with us on that perspective about the past, the value of this heritage? Did you have any thoughts on that and where that goes next? Because it feels as though, obviously this isn't on you personally, this is archaeology in general over the past, say, 10-15 years. It feels as though we have some work to do, even amongst, within the academic sector, never mind the public and the hobbyist realm.
Yeah, no, I think we do. And I think, actually, I do think you need to take every single opportunity to call out that sort of misunderstanding.
I did. I just didn't want to shout him down. Yeah.
Help people to understand the error of their ways. A lot of it comes down to communication, of course. And I don't think archaeologists necessarily are particularly good at communicating some of those key messages about how we operate and some of the kind of underpinning principles of our discipline. I think what we need to be trying to see is, if you look at, and the obvious comparator is the collecting rare bird eggs, where several decades ago that was quite a normal activity. Now it's seen as completely unacceptable. And we need to be getting ourselves in a place where a similar thing happens in relation to historic artifacts, where the appropriate place for historic artifacts is in a publicly accessible museum.
To coin a phrase.
And that's a straightforward message. And we need to make sure that everybody understands that. But often we spend an awful lot more time communicating now via social media channels. But actually, we have to think very hard about, really, are we reaching out beyond the bubble that is the immediate archaeologists and their immediate colleagues by using those technologies and those channels?
That ties in very much.
So I was going to say, fundamentally, I think we think really hard about how do we reach the broad public with some of these key messages. Where are we getting on to the places where the public look? So we go beyond that informed public that we already have with us.
Yeah.
That ties in very much with what another one of our sort of community questioners, James, wanted us to ask you, which was about the future of outdoor education, really, in the historic built natural environment. James argues that over the last 10 years or so, that appears to have dropped from the list of priorities of organisations like Historic England. Obviously, English Heritage is now primarily interested in the footfall at the sites that it manages. And he points out that the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment and the Royal Institute of British Architects do, he would say, a lot more in terms of educating the public about their particular sectors than archaeologists do at the moment, or certainly in a joined-up way. Would you agree with that?
I think that's probably right, and I think that has been one of the casualties of the financial cuts we've all seen in our sector over the last 10-15 years. I mean, one of the greatest sadnesses for CBA when it had all those cuts from the British Academy was that one of the first posts we had to lose was our head of education. It's very unfortunate, I think, that we haven't had the resources within our sector to do more in that area. I think one of the interesting consequences of the current lockdown is that there's a lot of interesting work going on online to pull together all the amazing resources that are out there online, which enable people to learn more about archaeology. And if this is an opportunity for us to then get that out to a wider audience through people who are effectively homeschooling at the moment in terms of young people, but also in terms of other people who are just looking for interesting content to while away their evenings at home, then this is an opportunity we mustn't miss. But the challenge for us is to get to those places where people will look themselves. They won't always, people won't always go in a museum. They won't always come and pick up an archaeology magazine or a heritage magazine. Mm-hmm. What we need to do is get that content in the places that they do routinely look, and almost kind of subliminally get that into their attention. That's where we need to spend a bit more time and effort, I think.
Okay.
And if we are starting to wind up now, you're about to hand over to your successor, Neil Redfern. Assuming you're not going to do what Liam Byrne did in 2010 and leave a note on the desk saying the money's all gone.
Well, the archaeology is all gone.
Yes. What would you say to him? And what do you think are the biggest challenges that he's going to face sitting in what has been up for the last 15 years, your chair?
No, I mean, one of the reasons why I feel this is an appropriate moment for me to step down is because the money isn't all gone. No. I think the CBA has a flourishing future ahead of it. We've been through some challenging times, but we've reached a place where actually we do have a sustainable position moving forwards. Mm-hmm. And I think we're still, as was proved by some of the surveys we've done recently, we still have a real job to do. Mm-hmm. And people look to us to do that work, both in terms of advocacy, in terms of public engagement, in terms of helping people to discover more about archaeology. The CBA has been active in all those areas, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. The challenge, I think, for the future is to kind of rebuild some of those areas of activity, and where are the priorities? That's going to be an interesting area. We may well come under a lot more pressure in terms of the protection of archaeological resources in the coming years. The CBA and other partner organisations are going to need to make well articulated and good arguments to preserve the systems we have now and enhance them. But the thing that fundamentally I always come back to, and which was what always gives me great heart, is that we have huge public support for what we do. It's amazing how many times you go to an event or to an activity and you start talking to people and they ask you, what is it that you do? And you say, I'm an archaeologist. I'd love to be an archaeologist. It's amazing how often you hear that. Uh-huh. So we have got huge public support for what we do, and we should really make sure we build on that in the future.
Yeah.
Do you think, though, that we need to do certain things in our own sector? I'm thinking particularly last year, 2019, we had the incident at the Society of American Archaeologists annual general meeting in Albuquerque with an alleged sex abuser allowed into the conference, and people complaining about that then being barred from the conference. And then obviously you personally were involved in the incident at the Archaeology Awards in November and had to respond.
We're present not involved.
And, yeah.
Yeah. So go ahead. Yeah.
And obviously CBA had to respond to that quite strongly. How do we regain trust of members of our own community who have lost trust in the way our community regulates itself and behaves sometimes, sadly?
Yeah, no, it's a very important area, and the CBA took a very strong stance in relation to the incident at the Archaeology Awards presentations, and it was entirely appropriate for us to do that. We all need to be calling out appalling behaviour where we see it, and the CBA, along with all these other organisations that are involved in archaeology, needs to make sure it doesn't happen on our watch. And we all have codes of conduct, or we should have codes of conduct in place. We need to make sure that our members and people attending our events follow those codes of conduct. We need to make sure that where people are being made to feel uncomfortable or worse in any situation, that we absolutely back those people up and we take appropriate action against individuals who have crossed the line. The climate has changed very significantly in the last few years, and absolutely appropriately so. And it is, unfortunately, an area where I think we're going to see more issues in the coming years. But I hope that CBA and other organisations like CIFA will take a really strong stance to make sure that everybody feels absolutely comfortable about engaging in archaeology in whatever way they want to do it, and have equal opportunities to do so, and are rewarded equally for whatever they do.
I suppose a related question, though, would be to what extent. So I've already answered the question in my head, in so much as obviously it comes down to each organisation and their policies. But to what extent should punitive measures be applied? In so much as is the safety of colleagues and their ability to feel as though they're not, for example, going to be bullied or harassed, of such importance that some people would find themselves excluded from, for example, meetings and organisations based on their behaviour. Does this come down to personal responsibility being monitored by organisations and institutions that they're related to, that they're connected to and that they're members of?
I think there is personal responsibility, but there's also collective and organisational responsibility. And I think all of those things need to operate. You know, the CBA over the last year has changed our constitution, but partly as a result of kind of some updating we were wanting to do, but also to make sure that we specifically have clauses within our constitution which will allow us to remove members who are acting in a way that's not in harmony with our charitable objectives, and will bring reputational damage to our discipline as well as our organisation. And I don't think the CBA should hesitate to use those powers in future if any situation arises which is clearly along those lines.
Okay.
And just drawing it to a finish, we decided we'd go all sort of magazine quiz and so on, and ask you just some quick fire questions just to finish. So 1 or 2 word answers if you can manage it. That look of sheer delight on your face, Mike, as I say that.
Oh, thank goodness!
Is that the time? I must log off now.
Hopefully there aren't any deliberate elephant traps here.
No.
So I'll start. Maybe Mark will finish. So favourite archaeological site?
Oh God, I hate these sort of things.
It's like saying favourite band, isn't it? Yeah.
Currently, my favourite archaeological site is Kilmartin Glen in Scotland, in Argyll, which is an incredible prehistoric landscape. I'm lucky enough to be a trustee of the museum there, which is just in the process of doing a fantastic redevelopment programme. It's an incredible landscape though, and I'd really encourage anybody who has the opportunity to go up and explore it for themselves.
Okay. Next quickfire question: favourite archaeological book?
Oh, well, of course, the classic one, which is probably the one I've consulted most over the years, is Renfrew and Barn.
Yes, of course.
Sort of the introduction, but actually, again, if you think about some of the books I've read in the last year, probably my favourite is Francis Pryor's book On the Fens. I think Francis is a fantastic writer. He was a previous CBA president, and I worked very closely with him for a number of years. He's a lovely man. And his book On the Fens is incredibly evocative. It's a landscape he knows so well. He's lived in it for most of his life. And it was there was a fantastic. It was Book of the Week on Radio 4 a few months ago. And I would, again, if you don't have the chance to read the book, then certainly listen to that, because it's well worth it.
Okay, Andy.
Ancient Aliens or Time Team?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Ancient Aliens or Time Team?
Well, I love a good alien story, like everybody, but fundamentally, it's got to be Time Team, hasn't it? I'm afraid.
Fair enough. That was a bit easy. This one's a bit more difficult though. Vikings or Last Kingdom?
Ooh, I've watched a bit of both, and I probably would go with Last Kingdom.
Oh, controversial. And I'll leave Andy.
I've got.
Yep.
So go on. No.
Go ahead.
And the last. No. This is genuinely quick fire. Otherwise, we could fill another hour just discussing that, I think.
Yeah. I've zipped my lips on that. That's it.
But imagine we potentially could fill an hour with the next one as well, and it's the last one in this particular section. And before we sign off, Indiana Jones or Lara Croft?
Oh, blimey! How do you answer that?
To be honest, I've never seen a Lara Croft film.
Oh.
So I can't really comment, but I have always enjoyed Indiana Jones.
Okay. Okay. Well, in that case, then, which is your favourite movie?
Probably The Ladies of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, classic. Yeah. Yeah. I
Mhm.
don't blame you.
Okay.
Okay.
And I mean,
Certainly not the last one, which was appalling.
Yes. Yeah.
we've
I'm
had
not sure I'm looking
we've got a
forward
long running
to the next one.
article here on Archaeo Soup and our podcast as to whether Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is actually canonical in the Indiana Jones series, or whether it's an outlier like the Apocrypha. Anyway, really just to finish up, Mike. Obviously, we wanted to thank you for taking time out this morning in these remarkable times and right at the end of your tenure at CBA, and we thank you for all the work you've done on behalf of archaeologists all over the constituent parts of the United Kingdom, and particularly the young archaeologists who the CBA has helped bring forward over the last 30 years while you've been with the organisation. How are you going to fill your days when you're allowed out of the house and can go back to work?
Well, I do want to make it absolutely clear that I'm not retiring.
That's what we wanted to establish.
I'm stepping down from the CBA role and taking on what I want to do is build up a kind of portfolio of paid and unpaid roles where I feel I can use my skills and experience to productive effect in the historic environment sector. So you'll be hearing more of Heyworth Heritage, which is my new consultancy. And I've got a number of projects in the pipeline, which you'll hear more about over the next few months.
Okay, grand. Well, so can I also just say that it's also been great because obviously I guess this is the third time that I've formally spoken to you, and it's been great to have such accessibility as well in terms of someone in this sort of role. So hopefully your successor will continue in that vein as well. But I just wanted to add that as a note as well, because I know other people who've watched previous interviews have appreciated the ability to just see and hear these sorts of opinions. So again, thank you, Andy.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
I've appreciated the opportunity to use these interviews as a way to kind of get some views across. I do think it's really important that the leaders in our sector communicate with a wider audience more often than they do.
Yeah.
They're often perhaps not as accountable as they could be to the wider audiences as well as to kind of their own memberships. I mean, as you know, I'm an active sort of Twitter user, and I've tried to use that as a way and to be accessible. And I hope that others will follow in that vein, because I think it is important that we're seen to be open and transparent in the way that we operate.
Yeah.
I'd echo that, actually, as somebody who effectively these days does a form of archaeological journalism. Accountability is an issue, because where people don't speak in public, suspicions and conspiracy theories grow, and that's not good for us. For society in general, and for, I think, archaeology in particular. So no, I absolutely echo Mark in thanking you for being so open and giving us so much of your time. So I think, well, perhaps we should just say thank you very much, Mike Heyworth, outgoing director of the CBA, Council of British Archaeology, incoming Eminence Grease of Heyworth Heritage. Very good luck for the future.
Thank you very much. It's been good to talk to you both.
You too. Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yes,